Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
Well, now here's another Rob Bowers story. The Caddo Critter by Rob Bowers. My buddy Dale and I took lots of road trips, aka fishing outings. It was not unusual for us to throw in enough clothes for a weekend and just take off on an adventure. My mother used to say I had a wild hair. Most of the time, Dale and I had a specific destination in mind. Sometimes we even made it to our original destination. Most of the time we got sidetracked along the way, and this resulted in our not being able to get to our original destination or not being able to stay at our original target destination as long as we intended. On one particular weekend many years ago, Dale and I loaded up and headed southeast for Sardis Lake. We had both heard story after story about huge largemouth bass being caught at the fast-becoming famous lake in southeastern Oklahoma. Dale and I both considered ourselves good bass fishermen. Of course, our expertise was limited to farm ponds and creeks, but that was insignificant to us at that time. We thought, in our ignorance and arrogance, that water was water and bass were bass. We made it to Sardis Lake without incident, and we drove around that lake some, trying to scope it out. We were both looking for likely locations to try our luck. We were both a bit surprised at how big Sardis Lake was. We had no idea, and this was the 1980s, and there was no internet, nor cell phones. We stopped at a few spots along the shore and cast our favorite lures in hope of hooking a trophy-sized bass. We did catch a few bass, but the biggest was less than 4 pounds. And we mutually decided what we needed was local information and something to eat. So we found a little bait shop in a small town south of the lake called Clayton, Oklahoma. As luck would have it, the bait shop also had a small deli inside. We ordered some food, and while eating, we asked a few folks inside about the lake and good places to fish. The only responses we got were pretty vague or tight-lipped. Evidently, the folks who had the info we wanted, or those who were willing to share the info, were not in the bait shop that day. We were on our own. We left the bait shop with full bellies. We stocked up on snacks and drinks. We spent the rest of the day driving around the lake, fishing and sightseeing. The fishing was fair, and we caught a few bass, a few crappies, and one walleye. We did not find a place to stay the night. We had to spend the night in my truck. I found a place near the water's edge, and we spent a listless night in the truck seats. And by morning, we were both a bit cranky. There was something about the place and the whole situation that just didn't feel right. Dale and I both felt it. Neither of us knew what it was. Maybe it was because the locals didn't really make us feel welcome. Dale and I talked about what we were going to do after we found some place to eat breakfast. We found ourselves back in the bait shop in Clayton. And while we ate our food, we talked about plans for the day. I picked up a newspaper left at a nearby booth. I was intrigued by a story in that paper. The story was about Caddo Lake in Texas. The story had a few pictures of the lake. I was struck by the pictures. I have never been to Caddo Lake, and neither had Dale. The pictures showed big cypress trees. The story was about the fishing at Caddo Lake and about a sighting of something called the Caddo Critter. According to the story, the Caddo Critter was a monster. Sightings of a Bigfoot-like creature happened around Caddo Lake for generations, the article said. There was even a movie made about the monster. The movie was Creature from Black Lake. That was the movie's name. And at the time, I knew next to nothing about Bigfoot. I'd seen a few TV shows and movies. The most memorable was the film, The Legend of Boggy Creek. I had viewed the Boggy Creek film 10 or so years earlier at the movie theater. It scared the crap out of me. I didn't know that Caddo Lake wasn't very far from the area where the events of the legend of Boggy Creek took place. Now, I pitched the idea of traveling to Texas to fish and look around Caddo Lake to my buddy Dale. I showed him the newspaper, too. Dale looked at the paper, then he looked at me with an eye roll. "And what do you want to go there for?" he asked me. "Well, nothing better to do," I shrugged. "It'll be an adventure." "Well, you and your adventures always get us into trouble," Dale told me. "Not always," I chided him. "Well, most of the time," Dale stated. "Listen, it's the crazy stuff you do when we're on adventures that gets us into trouble," I told him. "You're nuts," Dale told me. "So you want to stay here?" I asked him, "and sleep in the truck again?" Well, I didn't say that. So we went on like that for several minutes, and then we headed out the door and down to Texas. I guess we were both a little nutty. As we drove that way, Dale asked me, "Do you know where we're going?" I didn't really, but I didn't want to admit it. "Get the atlas out of the glove box and find the highway we need to take," I advised Dale. And Dale did that. We did make it to Caddo Lake. We found a little town named Jefferson. That was just west of the lake. We found us a place to stay for the night. We had some daylight left to drive around the lake some. I'd never seen a lake like Caddo Lake. The lake had cypress trees and Spanish moss hanging from the trees. It was cool and kind of creepy. The next morning, we ate a good breakfast and talked to some nice folks at a lakeside bait shop that rented boats. After we bought a Texas fishing license, we rented a 16-foot John boat that had a white liner in it. Sitting in the boat was like sitting in a big bathtub. And the boat had an 8-horsepower motor on it. Now, Dale and I were both chatting up the couple running the bait shop. We asked about the fishing, where to fish, what the different fish species were biting on, the usual things fishermen want to know. Well, they gave us some information. I finally asked a question that I was itching to ask. "So," I asked slowly, "what's the news on the Caddo critter? Any recent sightings?" The man and the woman both looked at me like I had two heads. "Are you two monster hunters?" the woman asked with raised eyebrows. "No, not at all," I shook my head. "I just read an article in a newspaper. Just curious, really." "It's all hogwash," the man waved his hand dismissively. "We've never seen it," the woman admitted. The man snorted in disgust and moved away while shaking his head. The woman watched him until he was out of earshot. Then she leaned towards us and told us in a low voice, "Lots of folks have seen the critter. I never have myself, but I think it's real. You boys best be careful out there." Her tone was ominous. "Well, okay, ma'am," I told her with a side glance at Dale. "We will." Dale and I walked out and headed over to our rented boat. "Why do you do that?" Dale asked me. "Do what?" I asked innocently. "That." Dale jerked a thumb back towards the bait shop, asking about Bigfoot. "Why do you always do that?" "I'm just a curious type," I told him. I can't help it, and that's the first time I have asked about a Bigfoot. "You know what I mean. You ask people weird questions and they think you're nuts," Dale told me. "And I'm with you, so they think I'm nuts too." "Well," I said slyly, "in your case, they're right." Yeah, Dale said. "Come on, let's go fishing." So we got our stuff loaded in the little boat, and we idled out of the little cove where the bait shop was. I was driving the boat, as usual. I angled the boat over to our right. I could see some trees in the water over that way. The whole lake looked fishy to us. It seemed, as we looked around, that every spot should hold fish. I slowed the boat as we pulled into an area where the huge cypress trees were just everywhere. Dale suddenly pointed off to our left side. "Beaver," Dale said. I looked where he pointed. Sure enough, a huge beaver was swimming almost parallel to us. Thinking back on that scene now, I'm reminded of a time I was fishing with my nephews, Tanner and Garrett. We were at Canton Lake and fishing off the riprap by the buoy line near the gates. A huge beaver was swimming by us. Garrett, who was 5 or 6 years old at the time, saw the beaver and jumped to his feet and yelled while pointing, "Look, Uncle Rob, a seal!" Well, naturally, Tanner and I got a couple good laughs over that. We still kid Garrett about the seal sighting. Garrett, of course, defends himself as best he can. There was a big body of water and seagulls and just the head of the big beaver visible as it swam by, so it could have been a seal, Garrett says. The beaver Dale and I saw at Caddo Lake was not as big as the one Garrett thought was a seal, but it was a big one. Now, soon after the beaver sighting, Dale and I started fishing. I eased that little boat over into an area that we both liked. The cypress trees surrounded us, and the Spanish moss was hanging everywhere. Once in a while, the breeze blew through, and the Spanish moss would wave and lift before settling back down. I had my favorite crankbait on my line. It was a crawfish-colored lure, and I'd caught a lot of fish on it in the past. Dale had some kind of spinner on. Well, Dale caught a crappie and a little largemouth bass. I caught 2 fish as well. I think they were both spotted bass. And Dale snagged a log that was just under the tree, and we had to move over to it so we could free his lure. I was working my crankbait along using a start and stop retrieve. I had my lure worked a little deeper than usual when it suddenly just stopped. Thinking it was a strike, I set the hook. There was no movement, just weight on the line. Well, crap, I told Dale. I'm hung up now. A tree bass? Dale asked me with a grin. I'm afraid so, I told him. May have to move over to it and reel down to it to get it loose. It has to be a tree or a log because it just feels heavy. I pulled on my line. I got some slack and I reeled that up. Is the log moving, Dale asked me, or are we moving? I'm not sure, I told him. Maybe both. After a few more pulls, the boat was right on top of my snag. That was good. I really didn't want to start the boat motor up and scare away the fish. We weren't sure how deep the water was. We thought probably less than 8 feet. Well, I kept pulling hard and steady. I would pull, then reel down, and pull again. The log seemed to be coming up. I see it, Dale announced, and I looked too. And I saw it too. There was a long, dark shape in the water. And then it popped up. But it wasn't a log. It was an alligator. It must have been 6 or 7 feet long. It came up almost parallel to our boat. We could see my crankbait snagged on just on the left side of its head. Now, Dale and I were shocked. And after just a few moments, Dale broke the shocked silence. How bad do you want that lure back? The alligator must have hurt him, or he moved when he spoke, because as soon as Dale finished his question, the alligator took off like a ruptured duck. It had been laying there on the surface, totally docile and still until then. I don't think it knew it was hooked, but it must have suddenly become aware of it, and it took off. There was a huge explosion of water when it took off. It almost jerked the rod out of my hands. The drag on the reel screamed in protest for about 3 seconds. Then the line just went slack. I reeled up, hoping that maybe the hooks on the lure had straightened out, but no such luck. That line had snapped. The alligator was gone, and my favorite lure went with it. I have never been able to find another lure like the one that gator took. I've found some similar, but none that caught fish as well as the one that I lost that day. Well, Dale and I fished the rest of that day. We caught quite a few fish. We also got snagged on logs and trees several more times. Every time we hung up, we wondered if we had another alligator. But the one that I caught was the only alligator we even saw. Dale wondered if the alligator had bit my crankbait since he was hooked in the head and near the mouth. But I'm sure I just snagged it. We fished Caddo Lake. The lake was beautiful and very creepy. We didn't see the Caddo critter. Our critter was just an alligator.